Okay, this is lecture 2 in our three-part series on the concept of democracy. Last time, we asked to what degree democracy was an ideal that we could only theoretically approach, or a real-world concept that helps us distinguish between different kinds of real-world regimes. We said that democracy, in some sense, is both. It's both a concept used to distinguish different kinds of real-world regimes and a political ideal that's held up to us as a standard against which we should measure real-world human interactions. We said that at a minimum, democracy was a form of government where the will or the interests of the people played a strong role in the formulation of public policy. In this lecture, I want to ask why democracy is held up as an ideal. Why do we care if the will or interests of the people play a strong role in formulating public policy? After all, for the vast majority of human history, this idea was thought to be rather ridiculous. There's two different ways of defending democratic and political institutions. I want to call them instrumental and non-instrumental, although you might call them consequentialist or non-consequentialist or consequentialist and deontological. Instrumental views defend democracy because of its tendency to produce good outcomes. Non-instrumental views defend democracy because of the way that democracy treats its citizens. Now, on the side of the instrumental views, utilitarians, who, remember, are one kind of consequentialist, might defend some democratic practices because of their tendency to maximize aggregate well-being. John Stuart Mill, for example, argued that open and competitive elections tended to bring about the best arguments for public policy, and that over time democracies were more likely to improve their policies in light of new information or superior moral arguments. On this view, democracy is therefore fundamentally progressive. As parties jockey for political power, they compete to provide the best ideas to the public presumably having some knowledge of what would make them better off, then acts as chief arbiter between these different political parties or these different ideologies, and at the end of the day, everybody gets to benefit from better policy. The benefits of democracy, you might say, are dynamic in the sense that over time, democracies have a mechanism for improving themselves, for improving the quality and the content of the laws. Other consequentialists, rather than painting a rosy picture of democratic performance, they focus on the evidence that democracies tend to avoid the worst sorts of evils in the world. That is to say that in democracies, people don't usually starve. Democracies don't have widespread famines. In democracies, the police doesn't usually beat up and torture citizens for no reason, and if they do, they tend not to get away with it. So democracies are a way of avoiding some of the most fundamental ills of human interactions, and for that reason we should endorse democracies. Not necessarily because it always does fantastically well at promoting the interests of citizens, but because it helps avoid the real obvious evils. Now, on the other side, we have non-instrumental views. The commitments of non-instrumentalists to democracy is often a bit deeper, because at the end of the day, their commitment is not contingent on democracy producing any good outcomes at all. Well, at all might be too strong, but it's not contingent on democracy producing good outcomes in any particular situation. Non-instrumentalists view democracy as a uniquely moral way of settling disagreements between free and equal citizens. In other words, democracy is the right answer to a question. And what's the question? The question is, how do we settle respectfully and morally disagreements between free and equal citizens in a political community? The answer that non-instrumentalists give is by giving each member of the political community the freedom to have an equal say in matters of common concern. It is sometimes said that no reasonable person could object to this decision-making process. Any objection would have to assume that some people are better than others, more morally virtuous, or perhaps have more of the relevant kind of knowledge necessary to make that sort of decision. Others will say that democracy maximizes a certain kind of freedom, so rather than emphasizing equality, as in the latter explanation, in this case, democracy maximizes a certain kind of freedom by giving individuals as much control over collective outcomes, as they can reasonably expect, given that each other person has unequal freedom to their own. So these defenses of democracy are either based in some kind of freedom or some kind of equality of status, and usually both. And the idea here, again, is that democracy is the right answer to a particular sort of question. Now, note that on this non-instrumental view, typically democracy produces both legitimacy and authority for the state. Democratic states give excellent reasons for citizens to obey their commands, and again, obey their commands regardless, to some degree, of the content of those commands. So, let's compare the two a little bit. Instrumental views tend to view democratic decisions as being justified to the extent that those subject to those decisions seem to have very good reasons to trust that those decisions will bring about some good. But of course, instrumentalists have no problem at all rejecting democratic procedures if some other procedure proves more reliable at producing good or at avoiding evil. So, the allegiance of instrumental views of democracy is always contingent. Democracy is good to the extent that it tends to produce good outcomes. When it doesn't in any particular situation, then we don't trust majorities or the people with the decision. We trust something else. So, for example, I'll give you an example. Non-instrumentalists have absolutely no problem in impaneling small juries for trials. They don't necessarily want the outcome to be decided by public vote. They would rather impanel juries and have very, very strict procedural rules for discovering the guilt or the innocence, well, the guilt or the non-guilt of criminal defendants. Why? Because the trial procedure, they think, would be much better than an election on the subject, because it tends to get the right answer more often. So again, instrumentalists tend to see democracy as a highly circumscribed sort of activity, use it when it works, but otherwise don't. Non-instrumental views tend to view democracy as being much more fundamentally good than that. That is to say, decisions carry legitimacy, like I said earlier. It would be wrong to disobey the decisions of a democratic procedure, even if you have some good in mind, even if you think that the democracy got it way wrong in any given instance, because to disobey that decision would be a form of disrespect to the equal freedom of all other citizens. So all the other citizens got together, or all the citizens, including you, got together to make a decision. Most of the citizens disagreed with you, or came down on a different conclusion, and now you're choosing to go ahead and disobey them. You're in some sense disrespecting their fundamental capacity to choose, their capacity to discern right from wrong, their status as equals. Accounts differ, but the point is that by disobeying the law, a democratic law, you are doing some sort of injustice to your fellow citizens.